The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Every year, Canada relies on hundreds of thousands of temporary foreign workers to fill essential jobs in several sectors. That should obviously not involve international human labor trafficking. Tonight, we'll assess why there's solid evidence that it does. Then, could expansion of York Region's sewage system result in a new threat to the Great Lakes? We'll debate that. It's Tuesday, March 14th, and that's ahead on the agenda. Dozens of newcomers rescued from deplorable living conditions is a far cry from the Canadian immigration story that this country wants to tell. But that's just what happened recently as police broke up an international labor trafficking ring operating in York Region. With us now for a fuller picture of how things can go that wrong and what to do about it, let's welcome Julia Drydick, Executive Director of the Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking, Loli Rico, co-founder and executive director of the FCJ Refugee Center, and Syed Hassan, executive director of Migrant Workers Alliance for Change. And as I welcome all three of you to our program, I just have to start by saying how much I miss your husband, your late husband, Francisco Rico Martinez, who was always such a great guest on this show whenever we discuss these issues. And I mean, I know we miss him, so I can only imagine how you feel about his not being around.
Yes, I miss him a lot.
But thank you for being here and continuing the great work you two do together. With that, let us set the scene here now for our conversation. And Sheldon, if you would, let's bring this graphic up. We're going to take a look at some data about migrant workers in Canada. In 2021, an estimated 777,000 people across the country were temporary foreign workers. 39% employed in agricultural, manufacturing, construction, and food processing sectors. A new report by the Canadian Centre to End Human Trafficking and FCJ Refugee Center, both represented here today, revealed that 55% of Canadians don't know that labor trafficking is a major issue in Canada. 81% believe migrant workers deserve the same rights and protections as Canadians, but 85% say they really don't know how to help. These stats released just a month or so ago. All right, let's get into that. I don't want to assume, Loli, that everybody knows what we're talking about here. So labor trafficking is what exactly?
Well, it's when a person, a human being, is being controlled by another person and take advantage of them in different ways. One is control of their legal documents with their passport, control of the time that they work. Sometimes they do work of, like I saw a client last week that was working from 7 o'clock in the morning to 12 evening, midnight, and they pay less than they supposed to pay. They offer in their contract to pay $18, and now they pay $11, $10. Also, they take away some money to transport, control of their mobility, because they take them from one place to another place. And that's what we can call about labor trafficking.
Why do you think, Julia, that this issue flies under the radar for so many people?
So not only are Canadians just not aware of the realities of labor trafficking, we see the same thing with migrant workers. So we conducted research with 77 migrant workers across Ontario. Similarly, half didn't know to recognize the signs. And they also didn't understand their rights in Canada. But we're also seeing that myths and misperceptions around human trafficking in the media is really doing a disservice to being able to understand the issue. So people think about the movie Taken. They think this involves forcible confinement. It involves chaining people to radiators, when really it's psychological control, coercion, and abuse that we're seeing. And so they will use different ways to threaten their family back home. Again, taking their passports, threaten deportation, even when there's no actual grounds for deportation. And they use that fear as a tool to control them, to force them into horrible working conditions, confiscating their money. And at the end of the day, it's all about profit.
Well, that's what I was going to follow up with. This may be a ridiculous question, Hassan, but who does this? Like, who would do this?
Well, the first thing to understand is that it's all legal, most of this. When we're talking about farm workers, for example, working without a break or 12, 14 hours a day, that's legal under Ontario labour law, right? When we're talking about theft of wages, people being housed in warehouses, again, that is part and parcel. And that's because the immigration law has created this fundamental power imbalance, not my words, Minister Carla Qualters, that makes it impossible for people to assert their rights. There's about 125,000 temporary foreign workers in the country, but there's 1.2 million people on temporary permits. And there's this, in our experience, for example, these workers that we just spoke about, they were being paid below $13 an hour. But now that the police is involved, they can't actually get their money back because it's the Ministry of Labour that controls getting your money back, right? It's
Ontario Ministry of Labour?
Ontario Ministry of Labour, and they're not involved. So when we start talking about things as trafficking versus labour exploitation, the police get involved, and we don't really, workers don't gain anything. And that's the fundamental issue. Workers need their wages back. We talked to these workers before the police raid, and some of them decided they didn't want to leave because at least they had a job. Now they've been housed for 2 months, as Loli knows. They're going to maybe get TRPs. They won't be renewed again.
TRPs?
Temporary resident permits, which won't be renewed, as Loli knows. And so we end up with this making it about trafficking takes away the fact that this is part and parcel of the immigration system, and the fundamental issue is lack of permanent resident status.
As you watch this issue, have you noticed an uptick more recently in the exploitation of workers?
Well, we can say that have been happening before. Now it's more like with the people, like the police now is learning that there is a labor trafficking. The labor trafficking had been happening a long time ago, especially with the immigration programs, because they come with a closed work permit. And you don't have a closed work permit working here with TVO, no? And like me, I work where I want, and it's the organization where I am. But they don't. They have to work for that employer. And that's the problem. It's immigration programs that they make them vulnerable to be exploited, because sometimes the employer is not a good employer, like we found, and then they come this recruiter and say, I will find you a better job, and they move them to another place. And at the moment that you change of job, you lost your work permit because you are breaking part of the contract that you need to work for that employer.
Let's just understand, Julia, because we want to understand how pervasive this is. Do we say that most employers are pretty good, but there are some bad apples, or is it worse than that?
So we really don't know, and part of it is because awareness is so low and people are not coming forward. It's about employers, and there's good ones and there's bad ones, but we also see exploitation taking place amongst peers and managers and various levels of kind of the management structure within these industries where you see large majorities of temporary foreign workers. So in our first year of operating the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline, about 6% of cases that we identified were labor trafficking cases, but that's really the tip of the iceberg. Like, we know that it's underreported, and part of it is also because it takes very unique, targeted outreach strategies to be able to connect with migrants because they're so isolated in our communities. Many are coming with language barriers. They're in rural and remote areas. They're reliant on their employer to transport them to places. And they're also not eligible for the same services as other permanent residents and citizens. So we've got a really robust set of programs and services for settlement, immigration settlement in Canada. They're actually not mandated to serve temporary foreign workers. So if we get a call on the hotline and someone's in an abusive situation and they want to be able to access housing supports or service navigation, there's a whole ecosystem of supports that categorically excludes temporary foreign workers, making them more vulnerable to exploitation and more reliant on their employers.
What countries typically are we seeing these workers coming to Canada from?
So we have about 2,000 members who are migrants just in agriculture, 35,000 in total. And they're coming from, in the agriculture sector, people are coming from Jamaica, from Mexico, from Philippines, all of these different countries. And when they're here, as Loli said, once they're on employer-dependent permits, it is impossible to be able to assert your rights. This is really crucial. If you have a right, say, to decent wages, how are you going to speak up? Because when you speak up, your employer can fire you. They can make you homeless because you're kicked out of the country. They can make it so that you don't come back in the future. Exactly. You can't get employment insurance. So really, it's immigration laws that give employers the power to exploit people, and permanent resident status is the only solution to make it better.
Julia, how did the pandemic affect all of this?
So these issues have been existing for decades and decades. Yes. I think the entire temporary foreign worker program was flawed since inception. And actually, we partnered with FCJ in 2019 to conduct focus groups with migrant workers, and then the pandemic hit. So we wanted to revisit this. So we saw a lot of the same longstanding issues of overcrowding and unsuitable housing, pay being confiscated, threats, also physical and sexual assaults, really, really horrible abuses. On top of that, when you layer a pandemic on top of it, it's just a powder keg. And so while we did see that a good chunk of migrant workers had access to vaccines, they were completely unable to physically or socially distance.
Right.
They didn't have access to rapid tests, even when they were widely available across the country. They didn't have access to healthcare services either. Now, employers are actually legally responsible to cover the healthcare costs of migrant workers before they are eligible for provincial programs. But we were seeing that migrant workers were getting sick with COVID, also experiencing injury on the job as a result of really poor labor conditions, and not having any access to those essential services that they actually have rights to as migrant workers in our country. So really, it just aggravated what was already a really exploitative system in Canada.
I want to ask you about one of your circumstances. Your refugee center hosted 77 migrant workers across 7 focus groups.
Yes.
I think Toronto, London, Leamington, Hamilton area as well. What did you share some of what you heard about their experiences?
Well, what Julia was saying, one of the challenges that they have been seeing is very poor home accommodation conditions. They have been seeing also they have been working long hours with very low wages. Also, the abuse, they have been discriminated with racism comments. They have been treated not like human beings, and especially the barriers with the language barrier, because when they have, and I can give you an example, there is the worker and the foreman, that sometimes they try to hire as a foreman someone from the same country, like Mexico, that they speak a little bit of English, that they can communicate with the employer, but they don't pay more to the foreman, but they use them to exploit their peers. And that's one of the challenges that they have been seeing, because the vast majority, when they come here, they don't have the language and also the education. And when the conditions here, sometimes they are working for them concept, is a better condition than in the home country. And in that case, to realize that they have been abused is very hard for them until we go and talk to them. And we start telling them what are their labor rights. It's very sad that in one of the cases, even when it's the relation with health, some of the women, they are pregnant women, and to have access to the health is a challenge to go and see a doctor, because the employer make them delay to have access to the health card. And sometimes they are sent them back home when they are injured, and that's one of the comments, that they don't report their injuries, because if they are injured, the employer has the right to send them back home, and then they don't bring them back.
Well, one of the reasons we're talking about this here tonight, as we mentioned off the top, is what recently transpired in York Region. So let's do a little background on that. And again, I'll ask our director, Sheldon Osmond, to bring up this graphic with some of the facts about the York Regional Police and Canada Border Services Agency, which recently shut down an organized labor trafficking ring through an investigation called Project Norte. The trafficking ring was operating in York Region and across the GTA. February 28th of this year, investigators rescued 64 Mexican nationals who were being exploited. 46 charges were laid, 7 people charged, 5 warrants executed, 3 buses seized. The Ministry of Labor's investigation is ongoing, as they say, and as such, working locations and company names have not been disclosed. I guess apropos of the question I asked earlier about what percentage of employers are actually in on this, how often do the cops get the bad guys?
Not a lot, and it's actually not the most evidence-based response in terms of getting to the heart of labor trafficking in Canada. So cops come in with these major rescues and busts, and it is a big press conference. For some migrant workers also that call the Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline, that's what they want, and we respect that. But the outcomes are also very, very, very long and arduous. So we're also right now in a situation where we're trying to find suitable emergency, intermediate, and long-term housing, protecting the human rights. The court cases, when looking at human trafficking, be it sex or labor, are 2 to 3 times longer than any other court case in this country.
So how long? Could go on for a year?
More
than that.
More than a year.
Years,
Sometimes 2 or 3. They're incredibly complex. It's very, very, very hard to actually convict for human trafficking because there's that element of fear, and often the credibility of the victim is put into question, and we see a lot of systemic bias, including racism and sexism, that's playing out in the judicial system. So this is really the beginning of a very, very, very long journey for those individuals that were identified as being exploited as part of the bust. And often it doesn't actually result in convictions or justice for those traffickers. Often what we actually look to do is to try them on different but related charges. But very rarely do we actually see that justice takes place under the lens of the Canadian Criminal Code's definition of human trafficking in Canada.
And if you want, I can give you one example.
Sure.
Like when we start working at the FCJ Refugee Center on labor trafficking, there were 13 Guatemalans that they were recruited and they were moved to another place. The trafficker, when they lay charges, because the police lay charges, the penalty, the fine was a fine, never was a criminal charges, and the person was banned for 1 year not to bring more migrant workers, and that also they cannot hire people around. And the 13 Guatemalans at that time, I'm talking 10 years ago, they managed to come back because we managed to negotiate with immigration that they can be clear because they were without status.
So what did you think of that punishment?
It's a very bad because now we have been seeing the same recruiter recruiting people and we don't know that we learned the lesson. With this case, there is another case that was in 2000, for the beginning, 2018-19, that was in Wasaga Beach, in the resorts. Still, there is no court. The court is going. We don't have any criminal charges. With this case, what Julia is saying is the problem is the people. The 64 is the 64 people that the police found. But there are more because this is something that has been happening. And it's not only the big rings. It's also the small groups that they come and the police doesn't identify them.
Well, who do you think should be leading the enforcement efforts to keep these workers safe?
I think the issue is that the police should not be involved, right? What happens when the police get involved? For example, I'll give you 2 cases. 45 Mexican workers are rescued from Hamilton 3 years ago. The RCMP is involved. They get temporary resident permits, which is a form of an open work permit, and they're driven to this much bigger farm and placed there. Now there, they are being paid below minimum wage, but it's legal. They're being housed with, they're being housed with 40 people in a house, 1 kitchen, 2 bathrooms. They're facing massive amounts of exploitation and abuse. All of it is legal, but the RCMP drove them there, right? When the police get involved, what happens is they can lay criminal charges, right? And then at the end, you may have a sentence, which, as we know, rarely happens. But what the workers need are reparations in the form of unpaid wages. They want, like the workers in this Project Note case, they came to us. We asked them if they wanted to exit the situation. They said no, because they had taken loans to come here, and they needed to pay those loans back. Now they're being housed for a couple of months, and after that, where do they go? Over and over again, people who are being rescued are actually being deported. This isn't a policing matter. This is a labor issue created by immigration laws and policies. Everyone loves calling it trafficking because it exceptionalizes it, makes it about bad apples, when the real issue is systematically the government has given power to employers to exploit people, and they'll continue to do so.
So if it isn't the cops that you think should be in charge, who should be?
The Ministry of Labor and the federal government needs to give permanent resident status to migrants so that they have the power to protect themselves. Why can't people actually speak up when they're being exploited? That's the fundamental question. And that's because their immigration permits tie them to the employer, or they'll get deported if they speak up. That's the problem.
Well, as a matter of fact, the Ministry of Labor, I suspect they had a hunch you'd say that. And here's what they had to say. Here's the Ministry of Labor, Immigration, Training and Skills Development. This is the Ontario Ministry. In a statement sent to us on March 13th of this week, it says, cases like Project Norte are why our government has introduced the most comprehensive temporary help agency and recruiter licensing framework to combat labor trafficking and has proposed the highest fines in the country for failure to obtain a license. It will require, hang on, I'll get you in there. I'll get you in there, Hassan.
Thank you.
It will require client businesses to use temporary help agencies and recruiters that are licensed. The ministry has also created the Divisional Intelligence Unit, a dedicated team focusing on labor trafficking and exploitation affecting groups of vulnerable workers in the most deplorable of conditions. You are champing at the bit to get in on this.
So
Go
first
ahead.
of all, the recruiter agency regulations is something we've been working on for 15 years. Multiple governments didn't pass laws. The Conservatives passed laws 2 years ago, but what they don't say, it's still not implemented. It's actually not enforced.
So the law's passed, but not
But it's not
enforced.
been enforced for 2 years.
Why not?
Good question, because there's no intention to make systematic changes when you can have press conferences about rescues and you can just talk about. Now, similarly, this intelligence division is actually a huge issue. Until now, an undocumented person or a migrant worker could go to the Ministry of Labor, make a complaint, and their immigration status would not be shared with police and immigration enforcement, which is a fundamental protection, as Loli knows, to get people to make claims. This division now actually is sharing information across agencies. We are asking for an information firewall so that they don't actually share information, because this will stop people from gaining, from actually accessing the few rights they have. So both these things, the first is not implemented and the second one is actually a problem.
Also, we need to evaluate, because it's just this unit start, because it's new unit, and also with the investigations that they are doing, they will see if they can implement it with the recruiter. But the main challenge is that there is not enough resources, because Ontario is a big province, and there is a lot of complaints. Because my organization, we have been helping the clients to do the complaint. And there is a lot of complaints, and there is not enough investigators from the Minister of Labor. And that's what always we have been seeing in every province, and national and also federal. Like, for example, the TRPs, the temporary resident permits, takes 3-4 weeks to be issued in a way that the immigration just to produce it, because in these cases, like the raid, Immigration Canada should go and give them the temporary resident permit, instead to wait the 4 weeks, because in that loop, the person in that gap, the person doesn't have access to housing, doesn't have access even to a work permit, and that's when they fall in a crack, and they can be fall again for another exploitation situation.
And as Loli, you know, even if you get the temporary resident permit, eventually it won't be renewed. I know you've been working on all these cases, so you become undocumented. So there's no whistleblower protection for abuse and exploitation. So I'll say this again. It's because this is systematic. Most of this is legal, right? In our center, with the Workers' Action Center, we're receiving hundreds of calls every week from people who are being paid below minimum wage, who are being, their mobility is controlled, there are cameras on their door, they're not allowed to leave. All of this, and more often than not, when you make a complaint to the Ministry of Labor, there's actually exceptions in the labor law that excludes them, or the immigration laws make it such. So that's what we need. We need permanent resident status for everyone to protect themselves.
Well, apropos of that, we talked about the Ontario angle. Let's talk the federal angle right now. And again, Sheldon, if you could bring this graphic up, I'll read along for everybody listening on podcast. And then, Julie, I'll give you first crack at this. Here we go. The federal government introduced sweeping changes to the temporary foreign workers program last year. As of April of 2022, there is no limit on the number of low-wage positions that employers in seasonal industries can fill through the temporary foreign workers program. Employers in 7 sectors with demonstrated labor shortages can hire 30% of their workforce through this program. For all other sectors, the cap is now at 20%, an increase from 10%. You following the numbers here? Labor market impact assessments are valid for 18 months. That's an increase from 6 months, which was the rule prior to COVID-19. Okay, lots of changes here. What do you think?
So, as much as Canadians like to think about immigration as being a core part of our cultural society, at the end of the day, when we're setting economic or immigration policy, it all comes down to economics. In reality, these are huge sectors that sustain our economy with jobs that Canadians are not willing to do. And I think we need to ask ourselves why. Part of it is that it's incredibly difficult, hard work, but it's also low wage, unsafe, not regulated. Folks like me with labor market mobility, someone that can actually choose who my employer is. And if I'm being treated badly, I can go knock on the door of a different employer and go, and I'll probably be treated better by law enforcement than a lot of the migrants in Canada. Really, we're seeing a failure in terms of our ability to have an economy that's inclusive and treats everyone with human rights. But the other thing that I want to say is, as much as we are increasing the caps, This isn't actually historic. We've seen higher numbers of temporary foreign workers come in the past, as recent, I think, as 2012. So we're seeing dramatic increases. We know that there are problems inherent to the immigration system that set people up for exploitation. I think now is a time for Canadians to be holding our governments accountable and to say, this is actually not the country that we want to live in. In our research, we also found that 93% of Canadians support the fair treatment of migrant workers. This very much is a ballot box issue because we want to be able to buy local. We like having a productive economy that supports, people living in Canada. So it's really about making sure that the system reflects our values and that everyone is treated with dignity and fairness.
If these changes were to be improved upon to your satisfaction, how would they be different?
So we have to look at a few things. First, there's an increase of about 38,000 temporary foreign workers in 2021 relative to 2019, pre-COVID. So there is an increase. But the increase is not massive in real numbers. We're talking about only 125,000 temporary foreign workers in the country. If you put that into the overall temporary system, there's 1.2 million temporary permits. They're coming under international student program, the so-called international mobility program, as refugees, which are getting a lot less attention. Actually, the temporary foreign worker program has become the smallest section of the temporary stream. Canada has now turned into a revolving door temp agency where 1.2 million people come in each year on temporary permits because that's how many jobs there are to fill, but they're not getting permanent residence rights. These changes are actually a reversal of changes that were made in 2014, long been lobbied for by corporations. The fundamental issue is what are the protections that are going to be given to these workers? And more importantly, how can they protect themselves? So long as we have a system where people are tied to their employers, who can be kicked out for speaking up, who cannot get health care, who are put up in housing that is not out of their control, they are dying because they're using pesticides that they don't have any PPE for or training for, when they're facing daily abuse. I mean, migrant farm workers of our organization wrote a letter to the Jamaican government calling it systematic slavery. And we just went to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights to show how Canada's treatment is racist. And we are hoping for a positive decision from them or a negative decision from Canada. So international organizations, other countries have all become involved. The Mexican government has been reviewing Canadian treatment of temporary foreign workers for the first time. I think the tide is turning on temporary foreign workers. Everyone knows that there is abuse, including the Prime Minister. The problem is we are not seeing the changes that have been promised. In December 2021, the federal government promised permanent resident status for migrant workers, students, and undocumented people. We are sitting here 14 months later. Nothing has changed. Instead, what we're seeing is easier access to workers, to employers, while the overall system is growing at such a massive rate.
We have talked about the fact that the agricultural sector is a significant player in all of this, and we have a statement here from the Ontario Federation of Agriculture, which we should get on the record. So, Sheldon, if you would, let's bring this one up. The Ontario Federation of Agriculture is horrified at this news. Those who misuse the system and harm farm workers can and should be prosecuted. Our top priority is ensuring the health and safety of Ontario farm workers. Without our seasonal workers, we cannot do our jobs, and Ontarians wouldn't have access to the safe and healthy local food they enjoy. The vast majority of our farms that employ seasonal workers do so by the book, understanding that they are integral to our food system. Lothy, I'd like you're smiling already, but I want your reaction to that.
Well, what can I say? At the minute that I met a person that had been coming to Canada for more than 20 years, and he was working on the tomatoes in the greenhouse.
Where, in southwestern Ontario?
In southwestern Ontario, in the Niagara area. And even you can go to Leamington, that's the famous place. And he comes every season, was coming from April to November.
Comes
now
from where?
It's from Mexico.
Okay.
And then he was coming from, at that time, now it's coming from, it's a year, like January to December. And still, he cannot apply for a permanent resident. Why the Ontario, the association, they should push to the federal government that people that have been coming so long here, and they are they keep bringing them because he's a good worker. Why not? They offer what is the pathways for permanent resident, and we will start avoiding all the abuses. Because they will have access, because they will have access to services, because that's the other challenge. They don't have access. They are isolated in the farms. We are not allowed to go and visit them in the farms. We try to visit when they bus them to get to the market on Sunday or Saturday or Thursday when they have the day off to do the shopping, and we talk to them and we give them information, but they don't have access to services.
Last word to you.
They're telling the truth. They're doing it by the book, and the book is that it is legal to exploit and abuse people so long as the federal government denies people permanent resident status. They're not lying. We need to ask why the book is this way.
And what's the answer?
The answer is simple. We have created, look, it's been since 1966, we've created this agricultural system under the Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program. 55 years. That means rural communities don't have enough housing, enough shelter, enough transportation, enough sewage to allow for people, human beings to live. There can only be these machines warehoused and exploited. The federal government needs to take away the subsidy effectively being provided to farm employers by giving these workers the ability to move. Right? As soon as people have the ability to walk away from a bad job, the system will have to adjust, which is why permanent resident status is the answer.
Let me steal 30 more seconds. Control room, if you would. Julia, give us the last word here.
No, I think we need to be changing the playing field in terms of how we're operating the temporary foreign worker system. I think open work permits are the simplest, fastest, first step that governments need to take. Again, it's about that labor mobility. It's about giving them the choice to actually move and be able to switch employers and enjoy the same employment rights that you and I do as Canadian citizens. And so with that and steps towards permanent residency and also making sure that they have equitable access to services and supports in their community, and also equipping all layers of governments and service providers to be able to provide services that are trauma-informed, that are safe, and to create those firewalls between CBSA. So to make sure that we're meeting the
services.
Yes, exactly. So that we're meeting the basic human rights and needs of individuals first, and then we can figure out immigration later. But if they're being exploited, the most important thing that we should be doing is actually getting them to a safe place with adequate supports and making sure that they're not being systematically exposed to abuse and danger.
Understood. I want to thank the three of you for coming into TVO tonight and sharing your views on this. Loli Rico from the FCJ Refugee Center, Syed Hassan, Migrant Workers Alliance for Change, Julia Drydick, Canadian Center to End Human Trafficking. Many thanks, you three.
Thank you.
Thank you.
About 15 years ago, the expansion of what's known as the Big Pipe rankled people in York and Durham regions. The pipe, or pipes really, carry sewage to a state-of-the-art water treatment facility which discharges into Lake Ontario. Not surprisingly then, the plan to expand again has stirred things up once more. And there is an added diplomatic dimension this time that has those concerned about the Great Lakes especially on edge. Here to outline why both sides of the debate have important points to make, let's welcome Michelle Grenier, Executive Director and Municipal Drinking Water Specialist at the Ontario Waterworks Association, and Gail Kranzberg, Engineering and Public Policy Professor at McMaster University, formerly a Director of the International Joint Commission's Great Lakes Regional Office. And it's great to have you two here in our studio for this conversation. Let's not assume everybody knows what we're talking about. So the Big Pipe refers to what, Gail?
It's, as you said, a series of large pipes, in fact, some of them you can get a car through, to take water from Lake Simcoe, wastewater and stormwater from Lake Simcoe, which drains into Georgian Bay, all the way south to a treatment plant to treat it to standards and put it into Lake Ontario.
What is the controversy here in your view?
The controversy here is it's quite complex, as you can imagine. There are issues around the interbasin transfer. There are issues about the joint servicing approach between York and Durham regions. There's City of Toronto and Region of Peel are also involved in the water supply side.
So 4 different municipal governments already.
Yes, and then growth pressures and the environmental impacts, and then obviously Indigenous rights in the area.
Boy, that's a bit of a brew of everything there, isn't it?
It is, absolutely.
Okay, and your concern about this is what?
Similar. On an ecological point of view, you're taking water that would normally go back into Lake Simcoe, which is a small body of water, and go into Georgian Bay, and taking it and diverting it into Lake Ontario. And that intrabasin transfer changes the hydrology of the place, which means...
Hydrology meaning?
The water flows. Mm-hmm. And it could mean that Lake Simcoe could go lower, Lake Georgian Bay could go lower, and it could destroy the nearshore wetlands. And the wetlands are the biological engines of the lakes. That's where the fish and wildlife and so on feed and nest and reproduce. But also, this is a political challenge because intra-basin transfers, transferring water from one Great Lakes basin to another, not outside of the basin, but one to another, invokes the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Sustainable Water Resources Act. It's a big word, but it's basically a compact between 8 Great Lakes states, province of Ontario and Quebec.
So now we're into international affairs.
We are.
Not just 4 regions within the province of Ontario.
Correct.
Okay, let's pick that apart a bit. The water levels going up and down. There's a concern here. Are you concerned about that?
I'm not concerned about that. York Region does have a tremendous amount of control over where it draws its water. So there are 3 different aspects to water supply in the region. The very northernmost part in the town of Georgina, the water supply is all surface water from Lake Simcoe. The southernmost part, so Vaughan, Richmond Hill, Markham, the water supply there is entirely from Lake Ontario through the agreements with Toronto and Peel. It's in the middle where it gets more complex. There is a blend there of water from the Toronto and Peel supplies with groundwater supplies operated by York Region. So the challenge is that watershed boundary, the divide between the Lake Ontario watershed and the Lake Simcoe watershed, runs right along the southern border around the town of Aurora. So we're looking at mixing there of water drawn from both watersheds. On the flip side, the region also has control over how much they draw from those different supplies and where the water is returned. So to the point of as we're talking about the big pipe, most of that is the City of Toronto water coming back down to Lake Ontario. Whereas up in Georgina, that water does flow directly back to Lake Simcoe. So there is an opportunity to balance the flows.
Okay, let me just get this straight. I mean, you say you are concerned about the difference in hydrology. I think you said the water levels going up and down among different Great Lakes. I mean, that sounds like it should be something to be concerned about, and yet when I asked you, you said you're not concerned. Why aren't you?
Well, York Region does have an agreement under the Great Lakes Sustainability Agreement for an intra-basin transfer currently. And it does allow them to withdraw water from Lake Ontario and bring it up, provided a sufficient amount of water is returned to Lake Ontario. Mm-hmm. But the balance of that agreement, the difference between what has to be returned, can be returned to Lake Simcoe. That's the diversion. And so there's an opportunity there for the region to maintain its agreement and balance the water supply needs there through that agreement.
Does that not assuage your concerns?
Not entirely, no. I still see the amount that was approved is now being exceeded at an order of magnitude, 2 orders of magnitude level. So under the Act, if you're diverting 100,000 gallons per day, for example, which is 380-something liters a day, you're okay. When you start enhancing that, increasing that amount, then it gets subject to exceptions and it gets subject to regional review by the Council of Great Lakes Governors and Premiers, which it hasn't undertaken. And it is a much larger volume of water, and it concerns me because I don't think we are wizards at being able to balance water budgets. Nature has a way of telling us what should be happening, and we're fussing with that, and that it's extremely... The reason the Act exists is to prevent this kind of movement of water from one place to another.
Meaning we could be afoul of this agreement that we've made with border states?
We could be, yes.
Isn't that a problem for you?
It certainly is. And it depends if you want to take it back another philosophical level in terms of the water that does enter Lake Huron does eventually make its way back to Lake Ontario, right? All of the water out of the Great Lakes flows into the St. Lawrence. So there is a natural flow of water through the Great Lakes. Obviously, it takes decades and multiple decades for it to do that. I agree with my colleague in the sense that diversions out of the entire basin are an entirely separate issue, and that is a much broader issue that's being addressed mainly south of the border. But in this instance, where York Region really sits at the nexus of competing regulations and competing legislation, and this is fundamentally the best option they have to service the growth that they've been mandated to accommodate.
Okay, let's pick up on that now, because the province of Ontario clearly is the operative body here, and the Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks is in charge of this. And here's what they sent us. They sent us a statement earlier this week, and it reads, Ontario is working to accommodate population growth in York Region by helping to increase the region's wastewater servicing capacity in a timely, cost-effective way while maintaining strong environmental protections. This will be done by directing wastewater to the state-of-the-art Duffins Creek Wastewater Treatment Plant that already services York Region. The plant is currently running at approximately 50% of its maximum capacity, with the added flow accounting for an increase of only 12% of total capacity. Even with the added intake, Duffins Creek will continue to run well below capacity. Okay, Gail, does that not help you?
No, not at all.
Why not?
Well, it has capacity. That's wonderful. So it can run at capacity. That's great. The point is growth in a green area where we need the water. Look, this is all attached to Bill 23, repealing the protections of the Greenbelt for housing. And many scholars, many knowledgeable land use planners will tell you that there's plenty of space to build houses without building on the Greenbelt, without building around that area. We want to accommodate growth, so therefore we're going to take more and more water from wastewater and put it into Duffins. Don't worry about it. Duffins plant is can treat it. I'm not worried that the Duffins plant can treat it. I'm sure that they can. But it's this desire to grow in places where we need spongy soils to absorb the water and get it back into the ground, rather than paving over surfaces and having more flooding as the climate changes. I mean, this is just problematic. That response was, don't worry about the wastewater discharge coming out of Duffins Creek. It's not going to hurt like Ontario. I can be convinced that engineers can figure that one out. It's about the growth in the region.
So this for you is really about messing with the Greenbelt. At the end of the day, that's what this story is about for you.
It's partly messing with the Greenbelt. That's a big part of it. But it's also, are we violating intrabasin parameters under the compact, under the agreement between the governors and the premiers? Because that sets a precedent, too.
Are you violating that?
I can't speak to that. Again, I believe the balance can be managed. To Gail's point about growth, the planning process looks at a really broad variety of factors when they decide where they want to see population growth. It does not consider the capacity to deliver water and wastewater servicing. There's a huge gap in the planning process that needs to be fixed. And in this case, what we're trying to do is bring the resources to the people rather than putting people where the resources are. And
whose responsibility is it to fix that, what you've identified there as a gap in the process?
That would come through the provincial planning process and the policy statement and places to grow.
And presumably somebody's told them to fix that over the years, and how come it hasn't been fixed yet?
I'm not sure that there's all that much awareness yet about the constraints, because this is really the first time we've come into this situation where there is no viable servicing solution that's readily available. That creates this sort of the competing legislation and the nexus and the issues they had to deal with in this instance. There are other smaller communities that are struggling to grow, and again, outside the Greenbelt, because they can't get approval to expand water and wastewater facilities because of other environmental constraints. But we are going to be knocking on against that door of this inability to build and fund new infrastructure to support the growth targets that we have because of various issues on the environmental front and approvals front.
In which case, let me ask you the bigger overarching question here, which is, we have a provincial government that's decided in its wisdom that it wants to alter the boundaries of the Greenbelt in order to encourage more home building in this particular area where they say we need it. We're now hearing about additional services that are going to be required to deal with all of that new population growth. Do you think all of that presents any risk to the future viability and health of the Great Lakes?
I think, to Gail's point, we have engineering solutions that are robust, that are reliable, and are efficient. The question is going to be affordability. We can build anything, anywhere, and mitigate impacts, but those always come with a cost.
Do we have the stick-to-itiveness at the moment, in your view, to assume those costs to deal with this future?
I don't believe we need to assume those costs. I think we need to grow where... Look, the Places to Grow Act is flawed from the get-go because it put locations without understanding access to water. And places to grow should have had something to do with access to water, access to servicing, and it doesn't. So
Places
now
to grow is this provincial law that basically sets all this out.
it is the complement to the Greenbelt.
Yeah.
So we have the Greenbelt, thou shalt not grow there. Where are you going to grow? Intensify your urban centers. But that's not necessarily where the government has chosen to grow. And now they're choosing to grow in the Greenbelt. So what is with places to grow, which is supposed to be outside of the Greenbelt? So fundamentally, this is a complex between threats to the Greenbelt's integrity. Servicing can always happen because engineers are smart and they can do it, and it will cost a lot of money, and if people believe that's where the tax money should go, that's where it will go. I think politically that's not a very smart move. I think you put people in places to grow where they have access to water, and you don't artificially move water around to get it to the people.
Okay, follow up on that if you would, Gail. Artificially moving water around in order to get to the people. I mean, I presume your view is that that messes with a certain natural balance that we have right now. What are the potential negative consequences you see?
The lakes have evolved over a very long period of time to function as a knitted unit of five, or say, like St. Clair 6, Simcoe maybe a little saved, but the flows are there, and the organisms that live in those places are used to how those flows were working. And now you're changing the flows. You're taking water from one place, putting it into a completely different watershed. How is that water going to get replenished in the place where it began? Because the lakes are bathtubs, right? They're glacial remnants. That's what the lakes are. They're only renewed by water from rain or precipitation. So once you take that water away and don't return it, it's going to change the ability of the nearshore environment to be resilient to a changing climate. Severe storm events, erosion, it no longer has those buffer zones if they're drawing down the lakes by getting water to another place, and those lake levels go lower. It destroys the wetlands, which are the buffer zones when we get severe rains or droughts.
Apparently everybody at this table agrees that engineers are smart people and can figure out how to do all of this stuff. But having said that, is there an aspect of what Gail says that you acknowledge is a concern, and that we ought not to mess with the flow of water in the Great Lakes too much?
Well, I think there's a couple of aspects, and Gail is absolutely right. We're trying to manage water quality, we're trying to manage water quantity, but the driver behind this project is the water quality piece. We cannot increase wastewater discharges into Lake Simcoe. It can't survive anymore.
Simcoe couldn't survive that?
No, not with the other inputs to the lake from other uses, land uses around the lake, and the growth occurring in the Simcoe watershed. So fundamentally, at some point something's got to give, and in this case, it's the water balance.
Okay, to that end, this is really the worst name of any agreement I've ever heard of, but we will just go into a little background here to help people understand this better. The Great Lakes St. Lawrence River Sustainable Water Resources Agreement. Okay, Sheldon, graphic, bottom of page 2, please. Let's go through this. The Great Lakes are a shared public treasure, as we all know, and Ontario has committed to protecting those waters through various international agreements. One is the Great Lakes St. Lawrence River Sustainable Water Resources Agreement. Just flows off the tongue, doesn't it? It's signed by Ontario, Quebec, and 8 American states, and Ontario's regulations came into force in 2015. The agreement bans new or increased intra-basin transfers, as we've heard it described, which are defined as the transfer of water from the watershed of one of the Great Lakes into the watershed of another Great Lake. Okay, Michelle, here's what we really need to understand. Are the plans, as we've heard them described here, do they in fact run afoul of this agreement, in your view?
I don't believe so. York Region has stated that they can service Upper York within the terms of their existing agreement, which was renewed in 2016, signed in 2010, and out to 2051. So again, with the growth projections we have right now, they can be accommodated within the existing agreement.
Now, you'll notice, okay, my ears listen. You said, I don't believe so. I don't believe so is not a no. Can you say no, or you think so, but you're not sure?
Based on the analysis I've done of the situation, I believe that they will comply with the terms of their agreement.
Now, what about you? Are you a definitive yes on this, or I think so?
You should be a lawyer, Steve. I firmly believe they are in violation. I am not 100% certain. There's some grayness here, having listened to Michelle and having listened to waters coming from here and going there and moving. It's a very complicated, including the groundwater movement to even build the pipe. I have listened to many people who are convinced that this is a violation of the, we'll call it the compact, because that's what they call it in the States, their Interbasin compact. There are many people who do believe it is a violation, and I sit in that camp.
Do you know whether American border state governors are aware of this issue yet and have plans to get involved?
I do know that they are aware, and I think they're having the same debate. Is this a increased diversion, or is it not? And I think because the issue is so complicated, they are aware, but they have not yet taken Ontario to task to go under review formally.
If it turns out, Michelle, that what we have planned here is in fact a violation of the compact, is that what they call it? The compact, what do you do then?
You can't grow in York Region because we have the Lake Simcoe Protection Act in place above, in the other watershed, which won't allow wastewater diversions there. And if it can't flow down here, there's nowhere else to go, because you can't take enough water out of Lake Simcoe to supply the needs and then divert it back to Lake Simcoe.
So
it doesn't work.
The growth plans for York Region would be dead in, terrible expression.
Absolutely, dead in the water
if we find out we're in violation of the compact.
Yes.
Okay, that will be unfortunate news to some people who want to live there, people who want to buy homes there, some developers who want to build homes there, the provincial government, which very much has a stake in wanting to do all that. But what about the overall picture? Would you consider that a terrible story if York Region were not able to be developed in the way that all of those groups have hoped?
No, and I'll give you an analogy. Way back in the 19-somethings, 1920s, 30s, 40s, we built homes in places where water tends to flood. They're called floodplains. And now with an increasing frequency of floods, those homes are at risk. And many people are advocating move people out of the floodplain. Why have that risk?
Yeah.
And my view is we put people's homes in places where they shouldn't be. And if the great plan to expand population growth up in that part of Ontario is facing massive challenges with wastewater and water flow and water servicing, then why not find more appropriate places to put those people, like places that are already built that you can intensify. I know everybody wants the single dwelling house, but
not everybody, but a lot of people.
Many people do.
Yep.
But if that's not available, then you live where it's appropriate to live.
Okay, let me put that to Michelle. Are you, in some respects, attempting to build homes in places, to use Gail's parlance, where they shouldn't be?
I think we have in some places, but the growth pressures faced by York Region are not unique to York Region. We have the same growth pressures in Barrie and Innisfil and all up the northern coast of, let's call it, of Lake Simcoe. And people are drawn to a certain area not just because there are homes there, but because they have families there or jobs there or other drivers keeping them to those regions. So if we try and build, we've had experiments in other parts of the province where Townsend was going to be the next big thing. It's not an if you build it, they will come.
Yeah,
right?
Sometimes you can't build it.
Exactly.
That was 50 years ago, I think,
Yes.
wasn't it, Townsend?
It's a long time ago.
Yeah. Okay, let me do one more thing. We've got a few minutes left here. And Sheldon, bottom of page 3, let's do this statement from Mark Matson, who's the president and waterkeeper at Swim, Drink, Fish. Isn't that a great name for an organization? Here we go. The plan to divert water from the Lake Simcoe Basin to Lake Ontario will raise concerns across the Great Lakes and undermine Ontario and Quebec's promises to abstain from this sort of bulk water transfer. This is very concerning, as it is a bad precedent for Canada to set at a time when the U.S. Southwest is discussing water transfers from the Great Lakes to respond to drought and low water issues outside watersheds. Bill 23, the aforementioned, should not be used as a way to get around Great Lakes agreements such as the Charter and the Sustainable Water Resources Agreement that binds all parties to keep the water in the watershed as the best way to protect Great Lakes. Okay, Gail, I'm assuming you're going to put a big check mark beside that. You can sign on to all that?
I rarely disagree with Mark. That's true.
Okay, Gail, anything you want to tell Mark about his view on this?
I would say my bigger issue with Bill 23 relates to development charges for water and wastewater infrastructure funding. And I think that's going to be the bigger problem moving forward.
How does that play out?
Bill 23 reduces the development charge for water and wastewater infrastructure, which means the burden is going to come out of property taxes. Instead of out of the developer's pocket, it's going to come out of the taxpayer's pocket.
This is what you just said is a controversial statement, because there are, of course, people at the province who don't believe that's going to happen at all, and they think that a lot of mayors are crying, what's the expression? The chicken little on this
No.
when the sky is falling.
No, it's a significant expense because the growth has always paid for growth. That's been the philosophy until today.
Right.
And Bill 23 changes that equation.
Okay, in which case, Gail, in our last minute here, what should, if it can't be this way, and I know you don't want it to happen this way, what do we do with all of York Region's sewage over the next 50 years if we can't do it this way?
York Region sewage needs to be treated in York Region. It's a simple answer. It need not be transferred, withdrawn, diverted to someplace else. It needs to be treated, and it will be expensive to treat. And part of the charter says, if you've done all the environmental and economic considerations, this is your only option, go ahead and divert. I don't believe that. I believe that York Region's water stays in York Region.
Great debate, you two. Thank you very much. I really don't play a lawyer on TV most of the time, but I'm kind of, I think, flattered that you both thought I did for a second there. Anyway, really appreciate you coming in today and having this very civilized discussion with us here on TVO tonight. Michelle Grenier, Gail Cransford, much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
And that is the agenda for Tuesday, March 14th, 2023. Elections certainly get the most attention as the big democratic moment, but what happens between elections matters as much, or maybe even more. We'll size up the current state of Ontario democracy tomorrow. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.